Tales Under a Broken Sky, Episode 21, The Possessed, Part 2. I am become death. The man watched as the city faded from view, bleached from existence by the terrible white-hot inferno that had been unleashed upon its unsuspecting residents. It is glorious. All those lives snuffed out in an instant. The survivors, an entire generation of people cursed to live with the horror of that moment. To carry on with the knowledge that not only is such evil possible, they have borne witness to its commission. The reality of the moment surpassed his wildest dreams for the little project. He had wanted death, wished for slaughter, desired carnage. But oh my, they delivered 100-fold. To realize to wield a weapon of such insurmountable power and destruction, it is transcendental. It is divine. It is beautiful. A thrill ran through the man's body as he tilted his head back and basked in the screams of the dead, ripped from their bodies as the searing heat incinerated flesh and bone. Their cries were a surfeit of pain, suffering, and misery, a desperate, anguished howl into the great unknown void of death. Twisted and tormented, they would never know peace, never know deliverance. They would only ever know that terrible roar, that blinding light, that magnificent cloud of ash and debris. What a fitting monument to the insolence of those who would seek the power of the gods. The man smiled as he turned from the devastation, the screams of those still living blending with his laughter as he faded into the shadows cast by a world in flames. Martin Hill groaned as he lowered himself into his office chair. Nothing he did was helping to alleviate the blinding pain raging in his temples. At first, he had naively believed the handful of over-the-counter painkillers he swallowed before leaving the house were actually helping. But as he turned onto the campus, the headache had returned, blurring his vision behind a haze of pain and tears. He narrowly avoided crashing into an oncoming vehicle, swerving out of the way at the last instant before coming to an embarrassingly clumsy stop at the side of the broad avenue. Clutching his head in his hands, he had cried, deep, shuddering breaths devoid of the tears that nonetheless burned in his eyes. I could have kept going, straight into that other car. All I had to do was keep my foot down, and that would have been it. The end of it. The end of all this. I need to stop it. Martin's face contorted wildly as he unleashed the silent scream, the tendons and veins in his neck bulging and straining against his skin. He slammed his fists against the steering wheel, flinching at the pain shooting through his wrists. Then again, and again, and again. Each new flare of pain beating back the agony that had taken up residence in his head. Each blow feeding and engorging the anger growing in his chest. It felt good. It felt freeing. It felt liberating. Martin hadn't realized how much pent-up stress and anger he had been hoarding, how much fury he held towards his job and those around him. How everyone was holding him back, holding him to standards that they themselves flauntingly refused to meet on a daily basis. How much he wanted all of them to just fuck off. Outside, someone started to beep their horn at him. Martin shifted in his seat to look back, a trail of spittle falling from his gritted teeth as he prepared to scream back at them. That was when he realized the pain was gone. The headache that had plagued him for hours had faded to nothing, a fading echo of that blinding agony. He forced a grimace from his face and held up an apologetic hand, wondering if the asshole behind him could even see his gesture or appreciate it. Back to his usual calm self, he had continued on to the car park, found his usual parking space, and pulled up smoothly. Relieved that he no longer had to deal with that incessant throbbing pain, he had made his way inside and up to his office, waving and greeting his colleagues and students as they passed him on the way to class. The rage that had consumed him now reduced to a distant simmer. Just an overreaction. Anyone could think things like that when they're in pain. It's nothing. Just some stress over my presentation later, that's all. But as Martin sat behind his desk, turned on the PC, and waited for it to boot, the pain in his temples slowly wormed its way back to the forefront. Bending over, he rested his head in his arms, listening with annoyance to the ever louder chatter in the hallway outside. Christ, I need to take a holiday. Get out of this place for a few weeks. He bit back a curse as the chirpy login music played through his computer's speakers and lifted his head to look at the screen. The bright background burned into his eyes, and the pain exploded once again, filling the space behind his vision with an explosion of stars. Martin found himself growling, an angry, guttural sound. The mouse held in a death grip and raised to throw at the screen. He wanted to throw it, hurl it against all those damn colours, rid himself of their unwelcome, invasive presence once and for all. He hated that screen more than he had hated the alarm clock earlier in the morning, more than he had hated that pompous asshole in the car behind him. What's happening to me? Where did all this anger come from? I'm not like this. This is not me. Martin stood, his legs shaking and unsteady. It was hard to think straight with that incessant pounding, interrupting every thought. I need some water. He was burning up again, that same hot, cold sensation that had left him curled on the floor of his bathroom only a few hours earlier. Reaching up a hand, he loosened his tie and unhooked the top button of his shirt. A temporary solution, but the small act of rebellion to rigid routine brought some clarity back to his thoughts. Martin left his office and headed towards the break room. He was slumped against the water cooler, his fifth cup of water dangling loosely in his hand, when someone tapped him on the shoulder. He jumped at the contact, dropping the paper cup in the process, and spun violently to see who had interrupted him. Rebecca, the faculty receptionist. Before he realised what was happening, Martin had his hands around her neck and was forcing her to the floor, bearing down on her with all his weight. She beat helplessly against his arms as he squeezed tighter, feeling his fingers sink further and further into her neck, feeling the soft cartilage of her throat bending and flexing under the pressure. Droplets of saliva dripped from his mouth onto her face as his own features drew back in a manic rictus. The pain that tormented Martin faded into the background as her face grew red and the panic in her eyes escalated to frenzied terror. The beating of her fists against his arms began to weaken, slowing to a standstill as her eyes grew unfocused, before finally settling into a fixed stare. Martin felt a life leaving her body, and shivered as a rush of exhilaration passed through his own. "Martin, are you all right?" Rebecca, the faculty secretary. Martin recoiled in horror and took a step back as he realized what he had been thinking about, fantasizing about. "What is wrong with me?" "Oh, hi Rebecca, sorry, I'm not feeling great. Must be the flu or something. I think I drifted off a bit there for a minute." "Not to worry, Dr. Hill, I'll get that cleaned up for you. Are you sure you should be here? I don't mean to sound pushy, but you look like hell." Like hell. That was just how he felt. He grimaced as another stab of pain flashed behind his eyes. I don't think so. I thought I had it under control, but I think this thing, whatever it is, has got a bit more of a hold on me than I thought. Would you mind arranging cover for my lectures this afternoon? I think a few of my grad students have a bit of time. Maybe one of them could cover." "That's not a problem, Dr. Hill. Do you need me to call a taxi?" "I don't think you're in much of a condition to be driving." "Martin, please." He forced a smile onto his face as he spoke. She had never done anything to deserve the violent intentions that had flashed through his mind. "And yes, that would be great. Can you notify campus security that I'll be by tomorrow to pick up my car? I'll call if there's a change." "Consider it done, Martin." "Oh, that sounds a bit strange. They're such sticklers for formality around here. I'll sort a taxi for you now. If you want to wait in your office, I'll call down when they arrive." "I actually think I need some air. Can you ask them to pick me up out front?" "Will do, Dr. Martin." Rebecca left to make her calls, and Martin turned slowly towards the exit, pangs of fear mingling with the ever-present throbbing in his head. What the hell is happening to me? The stranger left Justin Shaw sitting on his sofa, sipping a freshly made cup of Darjeeling and staring out the window in a daze. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to know. He had dedicated a sizable part of his life in service to his God, yet for all his praying and worship, for all the baptisms and communions he had overseen, Justin had never experienced, never felt for himself any kind of divine presence. It was why he had eventually left the priesthood. What had once been his calling, a vocation he had welcomed with open arms, had become an immense source of distress and concern. No amount of religious retreats, Bible readings, or quiet moments of contemplation had been enough to assuage the doubts that had plagued his heart. So he had left behind his vestments, his duties, and for many intents and purposes, his God. Justin had travelled the world after his laicization, searching for the meaning, for the faith that had eluded him. He had broken bread and worshipped with people of many faiths during that turbulent time. But it wasn't until he returned home, broken and weary from his perceived failure, that he had finally found what he was searching for. It was a moment he would never forget, still as clear and vivid in his mind as it had been all those years ago. It was a moment that came closer to divine revelation than anything he had ever experienced during his time in the church. And with all of his learning, his travels and his searching, he had finally found the answer to his questions in the place he had least expected it, in the one place he had never really thought to look. Now, 30 years later, everything that he thought he knew about the universe, about life, had once again been turned on its head. Justin thought he had found his meaning, his place in the world, but then the stranger had appeared in his living room, sipping his good tea, and proceeded to spout revelation after revelation for most of the afternoon. It was as unnerving as it was surreal. In the beginning, he didn't want to believe any of it, but it was impossible to deny the weight of that man's presence, the profound sense of peace and wisdom that had accompanied his every word. It was hard to believe that after his years of praying, of questioning, of searching, that the truth would find him in his twilight years, in such an absurd combination of the sacred and the mundane. The stranger's words had explained everything and nothing. They had put reason and sense to so many of the faults Justin had found in his worship, except for one question. The question that had plagued him across decades. Why? Because that was the frustrating thing about that question, wasn't it? You could keep applying it, keep digging, keep searching, keep prying. But there was never a true bottom to that barrel. In the end, it always came back to that one word. Why? For every answer, there was always another question. Always another layer of meaning. Another layer of obfuscation. For many who had shared his calling, one answer was always enough. God's will. But for Justin, that had never been enough. And questioning that idea, the concept that lay at the very foundation of religion, had been the beginning of the end for his vocation. Because for him, and others had thought him naive or weak in faith for it, the next question was always why. Why was it God's will? Why would God let such a thing happen? When Justin had posed that question to others, probing them for an answer that might ease the conflict he was feeling towards his beliefs, there had never been a satisfactory answer, just more dogma, more hollow precepts, more vague and abstract philosophical meanderings. Some said it wasn't their place to know God's mind. Others said it was a test to discern the faithful and the righteous from those of weaker faith. To Justin, the first hinted at a cold and detached deity, unconcerned with the universe they had manifested. The other spoke to a cruel and jealous God, one who had demanded absolute obedience and subservience, at odds with the love their clergy preached. It had always troubled him that his peers couldn't see the contradiction between those beliefs and the concept of free will, and on the few occasions he had pointed that out, the very few, because he had quickly learned not to even bother, it had only resulted in more problematic doctrine being espoused. The question of morality was always a difficult one for Justin. The free will to choose whether to be good, in all the ambiguity that entailed, or to do evil, equally ill-defined. But what about those who chose a different path, who chose to be good outside the shackles of religion, without carrying the weight of dogma and doctrine? Those who choose righteousness, devoid of the teachings of those who had failed to live up to their own standards? What of those who found their morality in another god, or gods, or in philosophy, or in the simple act of being kind? Were they not deserving of a reward in the afterlife? Or were they more deserving, maybe, as they did so without the promise of those rewards? What was piety if one was only pious under duress, with the threat of eternal damnation held above their heads? Justin had never found the satisfactory answer to those questions. During his priesthood, he had studied theology and philosophy with relentless fervour, devoting every hour outside of his duties to the feverish quest for understanding. But there was never one true answer, just that lingering doubt. Why? Even his visitation, he shuddered at that word and all its hidden connotations, had left him with more questions than answers. If the stranger was who he said he was, and Justin was leaning on the side of believing, then he was once again forced to ask why. If the devil did truly exist, and had his hand in all manner of disasters throughout history, then why had God not yet done anything about it? Why was it only now that they were turning their divine eye to the plight of their followers? And why him, a former priest who had abandoned his vows and had more doubts than anything else? The stranger had told him that everything he knew about history, every war, every assassination, every rampaging empire, had been the work of evil, the result of its subtle influence over the course of events, a tapestry of hatred and division stretching back millennia. And now, of all people, this stranger, or God, or whoever, needed Justin to help prevent the next atrocity. An arthritic ex-priest who spent most of his day deciding whether to take a nap or have another cup of tea. Christ, I can barely walk up the stairs to my apartment, and he expects me to take center stage in a celestial war between good and evil? The troubling aspect of the whole thing was not just that Justin believed him. It was that, for the first time in a long time, he was starting to see purpose in life again. And there was the question of morality. Now that he had been given that information, could he stand by and do nothing? Justin knew the answer already, because for him, it had never really been a question. Tim Masters glanced nervously over his shoulder as he turned the key in his front door. In all his years of training and practice, he had always prided himself on being able to separate his work from his personal life. Leaving his baggage at work was a simple matter of course, as much a part of his routine as buttoning his shirt or picking out a tie in the morning. But something was different that evening. Ever since his encounter with Maria that afternoon, he had been anxious and distracted, terrified, which was perhaps the most disconcerting part of the whole situation. It was not the first time he had seen someone break down. That was part and parcel of the work he did. Working in the psychiatric ward virtually guaranteed it. But he had never been scared of a patient before. Worried, yes. Concerned for their safety, yes. But never physically scared for his own life. It wasn't just the things that she said. It wasn't the first time he had been threatened, or how she had said them, in that maniacal, unhinged voice, so unlike her own. It was the specifics. As she had crouched over him, prodding him in the side, he had seen himself in his own home, on his own couch. There was no way she could have been able to describe some of those details. Guessed, maybe. But it wasn't just the physical description she had given. It was what she had said about the man she was going to kill not being a good listener. Tim had always regarded himself as being good at his job. He liked the work. He was fascinated by the study of the human mind, and he genuinely cared for his patients. He wanted them to get better. But lately, he had been distracted. Tim didn't like to let his own personal issues impact his work, but that was something he was finding increasingly hard recently. And no, he hadn't really been listening to Maria. Taking notes, yes. Working towards a diagnosis and treatment plan, yes. But he hadn't really been listening either. Maybe if he had, he would have seen what had happened coming. He might have seen her growing detachment from reality as more of a concern. Maria's issues with time and memory had been a curiosity for him. They were as close to unique as you could get in his field, but he had treated them as little more than a curiosity, not as a symptom of a greater problem. Her change. It had been so sudden, so dramatic, and so far from the woman he had come to know over the previous few months. It had terrified him. He had seen her break down before, seen her angry, but that anger had always been directed at her own person. But that sudden shift, the explosion of violence directed towards him, that was new. Tim's keys clattered loudly on the small table by the door, and he flinched as the silence of the empty house flooded back in. He didn't think he would ever get used to that, the absence of life in his home. It had been a year since his wife had passed, and he didn't think he would ever get used to her not being there. He approached his kitchen, snaking his hand around the door frame and probing for the light switch before he entered. Sighing loudly as the light flickered on, he surveyed the empty room. It was ridiculous, he knew. There was no one there. His fear was irrational. As unnerving as his earlier experience was, Maria was back in her room at the hospital. Even if she were to escape, and did plan to enact her dreams, she had still been there when he left. Tim shook his head angrily. The very fact that he was considering that disgusted him. She was his patient, not a criminal. She had done nothing wrong. She needed his help, not his judgment. If Anne were here, she'd know what to do. She always knew what to do. A hot flash of grief flared in his chest at the memory of his wife. Tim reached for a glass and started to walk across the kitchen to the small liquor cabinet by the entrance to the living room. He knew better than to self-medicate. After all, how many times over the years had he cautioned his patients about over-reliance on alcohol or drugs after a loss? One drink was all right, just to steady his nerves. One quick drink before dinner, while he was finishing the half-completed crossword from breakfast. Tim jerked awake, gasping at his sudden return to consciousness. He grimaced as he shifted in his chair, and a sharp bolt of pain flashed along the side of his neck. Blinking, in an attempt to clear his bleary vision, his eyes settled on the empty whiskey bottle. Fuck! The room slipped in and out of focus, keeping time with the throbbing in his head. He groaned at a sudden burst of nausea and sank back into the chair, wondering if he felt more or less disorientated with his eyes closed. Not the first time, and probably won't be the last. The admission stung. It had been happening with increasing frequency since the initial shock of Anne's death had worn off. At first, it had just been one drink, then two, and then, before he knew it, he was on a first-name basis with the young man who always seemed to be on duty at the off-licence, always there to greet him when he made one of his increasingly regular excursions. It was becoming a problem, a crutch, and he knew that if he didn't do something about it soon, it was going to take over. What worried Tim the most was that part of him didn't seem to care, and was quite willing to let that be a problem for another day, for a less stressful day, for a day when he didn't need a drink to go to sleep, or to calm down when he got home from work, or to forget for just a moment that his wife was gone, and there was nothing to be done to get her back. That he was alone. Tim stood, and the room tilted around him. He grabbed the side of the armchair to steady himself, and found himself facing the French windows looking out onto the garden. Someone was standing outside, looking in at him. Not Maria. He stifled a laugh at the absurdity of his relief. Steadying himself, he strode, or at least attempted to, towards the window, determined to give whoever was outside hell for intruding on the privacy of his home, for encroaching on the intimate embarrassment of his growing addiction. Tim fumbled at the handle, momentarily confused as to why it refused to move. before remembering the key. He flushed with shame and anger as he thought about the stranger outside, bearing witness to his downward spiral. Finally succeeding in turning the key on his third attempt, Tim slid open the door angrily and stepped out into the garden, his mouth already open and prepared to go on the offensive. There was no one there. The garden was empty. He was alone, drunk, and flitting erratically between anger, shame, and embarrassment. Stepping back inside, he closed the door behind him and turned back to the room. The stranger was standing by his armchair, their shadowed face looking down judgmentally at the empty bottle. When the stranger raised their face, 2 red eyes burned in the shadows. Tim jerked awake, gasping at his sudden return to consciousness. He grimaced as he shifted in the chair, and the sharp bolt of pain flashed along the side of his neck. Blinking, in an attempt to clear his bleary vision, his eyes settled on the empty whiskey bottle. Fuck! The memory of those eyes burned in his mind as he fought the urge to scream. The nurse assigned to monitoring Maria was concerned. She had been checking in on her every half hour since the young woman had returned from her session with Dr. Masters. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Maria had been upset, yes, but she had seen that before. She knew what to do. What she hadn't seen before was how shook Dr. Masters was after the session. She had never known him to be anything but composed. She could have sworn he aged 10 years during that session. He hadn't even looked that broken the day he received the call telling him his wife had passed away. A tragic hit-and-run incident the driver never found. Maria was to be closely monitored every 30 minutes for the night, no exceptions. Her door was visible from the nurse's station, and there were to be eyes on it constantly. Dr. Masters was to be notified of any change in her behaviour or temperament. In all her years working in the hospital, she had never seen anyone as concerned as he had been. She had seen many patients at risk of self-harm, but this was different. It was hard to believe that lovely girl could scare anyone. Maria was always so polite and mild-mannered any time she talked with her. Maria had been asleep at the 3 a.m. check-in, but when the nurse returned 30 minutes later, she was no longer in her bed. Positive that no one had left the room, she herself had been watching the door. The nurse entered the room to check on her charge. Maria was crouched in the corner, hugging her legs to her chest and rocking back and forth. She was muttering something, but the nurse was unable to make out the words. Stepping further into the room, she had called Maria's name, hoping to get her attention. The woman just kept muttering to herself, giving no indication that she had even heard. The nurse had said her name again, this time louder. Still no response. When she spoke her name a third time, however, Maria's head shot up from where it lay between her arms, and she had snarled, her lips drawing back from her teeth and face contorting into a savage parody of itself. The nurse had fled the room, slamming the door behind her. Returning to the desk, her eyes never leaving the door to Maria's room, she had dialed Dr. Masters' number. The phone rang out. She hung up and redialed. Nothing. Again. Again, nothing. Afraid to move, afraid to look into the room again, she stood at the desk, arms clutching her sides, her eyes fixed on the door. At some stage during the night, Maria had started to talk louder, her voice becoming audible out in the hallway. Then, those words had turned to screams and shrieks, and eventually into a manic cackling that the nurse was sure would wake the rest of the ward. But no one else stirred. Maybe, even if they had, they were too afraid to leave their rooms. The nurse was still standing at the desk, staring at the door, when Dr. Masters returned in the morning. He looked tired and worn, sipping desperately from a large takeaway coffee. She barely noticed him walk in, but as soon as he saw her, his eyes went wide, and dropping his coffee, he rushed towards Maria's room. When he returned 15 minutes later, the nurse handed him a hastily typed letter of resignation and started to gather her things. Dr. Masters didn't argue with her. Welcome, folks, to episode 21 of Tales Under a Broken Sky. I am your host, Keith, and I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. This week, we return to The Possessed for the second installment of my newest long-form story. As I get more into writing this, I'm seeing this being on the long side of the novella format. I think the way I want the pacing of the story, that expanding it into something more novel-length might take away from that, although I'm sure this could change as we get further along into the story. This was an interesting chapter to write. I probably learned as much about the characters as you did, the listener. I have a few chapters of this story outlined already, and a few of the characters mapped out in my mind, but as I was writing this week's episode, I was continuously finding new quirks and little bits of character that I failed to see prior to writing. The Dark Stranger continues his presence at important events in history. His location this time was planned in advance, and was much as I imagined it, although it took place slightly later in history than I had initially thought. Part of Martin's story also took me by surprise. I'd originally intended to start this section later on in his day, but instead when I sat down to write, I found that continuing the story from just after we left off in the last installment was the better path, bringing a better sense of continuation than skipping forward a few hours. His interaction with Rebecca was also different than intended. Initially, it was just meant to be an angry response when interrupted, instead of evolving into a kind of waking dream that hinted at a faster decline in his mental state than I had initially foreseen. The scene with Justin was probably closest to my original plan. I'd always envisioned his character as a former member of the priesthood, with similar issues of fate as described. But placing this scene further on, rather than as a long dialogue with the mysterious stranger, as I had initially planned, seemed a better move. I don't want to spend long periods of time stuck in dialogue and exposition, although one could probably argue that his long philosophical meandering was just that. But I felt leaning more towards the personal, with the heavier revelations from the stranger pushed into the background, was more fitting for the character. He is locked in a never-ending internal debate about morality and the role of God and religion in the world, and knowing already that this will play an important part in events later on, wanted to bring this more to the front than in my initial plan for the chapter. Tim's growing reliance on alcohol to get through his day was not something I had even considered, literally right up to the point that I started to write it. Nor was the death of his wife. She was never going to be a character in the story to begin with, but the additional trauma his character is recovering from provides a much better foundation for where I want to take his part in the story. I was tempted to write Maria's part from her point of view, but I liked the way the viewpoint from the first installment worked, and I thought that the idea of having it more from an observer's viewpoint would in some way highlight the external manifestation of what's happening to her better than having her thoughts exposed this early on in the story. I think of it as a contrast to Martin, where we have direct access to his experiences. Overall, I'm very happy and excited with where this story is heading. I didn't actually have any of it written down prior to sitting down to draft it this week, and the words are coming pretty easily, a lot easier than some of the other pieces I'm working on at the moment. Outside of the podcast, I challenged myself to write a moderate-length horror novella this month. I have been a long-time participant in certain November writing challenges, but after the revelations of the last few years, I've been a bit reluctant to support those organizations again. So instead, I just set myself a challenge completely independently. The progress on that story is slower than intended, mainly due to the heavy tone and atmosphere I set in the initial chapters, and it's taking me quite a while to get the words just right when I sit down to write it. I don't think this one will feature in the podcast directly, although I plan on releasing the story, hopefully sometime at the start of the new year. Well, once I first get around to finishing it and then editing it into the final shape that I already have a bit of a vision for. I will perhaps do an audiobook version, and I will probably release a chapter or two of that on the podcast around the time, kind of as like a promotional thing. That plan is still quite early in the making, however. For now, I'm desperately trying to avoid Christmas music and keep my head down with my writing, which I have an ever-increasing amount of between this project and my other non-podcast related stuff. Which reminds me, I have a few things I should actually be doing. So, until next time, thank you for listening to episode 21 of Tales Under a Broken Sky. I hope you enjoyed this week's production as much as I enjoyed writing and recording it. If you did enjoy it, please consider subscribing to the podcast on your platform of choice and leaving a rating and/or review. Thank you again for your time. Stay tuned to hear a brief trailer for the next episode. Tales Under a Broken Sky, Episode 22, The Witches of Kildanu, Part 2. Hi, Sarah?
Hi, Maisie.
She trailed off, and that silence disturbed Maisie. There was something in the way her words just faded, as if she was being pulled away. Is everything all right? Her answer came in the silence, which felt awkward, even over the phone. For some reason, she could see her friend opening and closing her mouth, as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't. Her heart sank in her chest.
Maisie. It's Mom.
Maisie's heart sank. She knew that her friend's mother had been missing. She'd even talked to her about it a few times over the previous month. But now the silence, and her difficulty speaking, spoke volumes. Sarah. Her words trailed off. She simply didn't have the words, or the heart to say what her friend couldn't. The line was silent for another 5, then 10, then 30 seconds. She could hear the deep breathing on the other side of the line.
They found Mom's body, Maisie, and...
Maisie's heart sank. She was grateful that her friend would have a chance at closure, a chance to bury and say goodbye to her mother. But Sarah's words extinguished the last hopes that she might be alive, and that pause at the end. Again, Maisie was more unsettled by the silence than her friend's words. I'm so sorry, Sarah. Is there anything? But she was cut off as Sarah interjected.
Maisie, they found her body. And they know who did it. It was my dad.
The world faded around Maisie as she stared blindly out her bedroom window. A flurry of wind stripping russet leaves from the tree outside. There were no words. No possible response to what her friend had just told her. Sarah, I'm coming home.